So this is one of the greatest Doctor Strange stories ever written by Marvel, and it's actually one of the saddest Doctor Strange stories ever written by Marvel, but it's also part of a series. It's actually a 5-issue miniseries called The Best Defense, and it's composed of a series of one-shots. It starts off with the Immortal Hulk, which, interestingly enough, the way this comic ends is the way the story initially begins. But it goes from Immortal Hulk to Namor to Doctor Strange, which is the one we're covering here, into the Silver Surfer, and into the Defenders one-shot comic, which wraps everything up. But what this does is this opens up with Doctor Strange himself, and he just says, "The end is nigh. I can feel the truth in my frail bones. Soon I will be dead, and after everything that's happened, I will welcome it." And he says, "But not yet." And he just picks up this rock seemingly out of nowhere. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is everything he does in this comic is important, and it serves a purpose, and it will come together at the end. So 100%, you got to pay attention to all this stuff. And so he continues on. He says, "The second piece in as many hours. I am close now. Time to pull out all the stops." And so at that point, he literally pulls out one of his eyes, and he says, "Magic has a cost, and I am broke." But then he says, "I can see again," because he puts the eye down into the Eye of Agamotto. Now, as any of you guys who are familiar with Doctor Strange know, the nature of the Eye of Agamotto is that it allows him to see through any magical illusions that exist out there and to see things as they truly are. But then we also get some context on what's happening in the world out here. The moon is shattered for the most part, not totally destroyed, but certainly cracked and kind of spread out in a destroyed fashion. The buildings around Doctor Strange have been obliterated, and we will get some context here because this is very similar to the end storyline from The Incredible Hulk, right? Where the world has basically ended. And so Doctor Strange says this, right? "I am Doctor Strange, the once and future Sorcerer Supreme, the last defender on planet Earth." Well, almost the last. And he says, "The Eye of Agamotto lights my path one last time. I hope that when I get to the center of this glassy wasteland, that enough remains from the impact for me to finish my journey. Dormammu's spawn will smell the eye. They will come for me, and I am counting on it." And that's exactly what happens, because then we also find out this entire landscape is just littered with the forces of Dormammu. And these are just grotesque mutations, where all these beings out here have just kind of been twisted and tormented and turned into these different things that Dormammu has created himself. And so Doctor Strange continues on. "I have lost track of the years since the collision that devastated the Earth. After the cosmic train wreck, our enemies pounced. Dormammu arrived and won the battle. Today, one of us will win the war." Now, this is an important statement when it comes to the Dormammu mythos within Doctor Strange, because one of the things that we've learned routinely is that while the whole train incident he's talking about is its own separate event, and it does tie into the larger storyline for the Best Defense itself, one of the big things about Doctor Strange has always been, if Dormammu found a way to enter into the main Marvel Universe, he would be nigh unstoppable. His level of magic is so extreme, no superheroes on Earth would be able to defeat him. Right now, that does not really pertain to the larger universe as a whole. I mean, as we saw in that Galactus storyline, I can't remember which one it was a Doctor Strange story, but basically Galactus ended up going to the Dark Dimension, or being sent to the Dark Dimension, and then absorbed Dormammu, and then got all of Dormammu's powers. To say nothing of magical beings like Zom, who are way beyond Dormammu in terms of his powers, and even Dormammu draws on the power of Zom. And Zom was so powerful, the Living Tribunal had to lock him away. There are certainly forces out there that could destroy Dormammu. But if you are a superhero and you largely operate on Earth, it might as well be the end times for you, because you are going to die. But that's one of the crazy things, is in the midst of all of this, Doctor Strange has this voice that comes out of his bag, and this voice says, "They are hunting you, Stephen." And Doctor Strange just says, "I know," right? And picks up yet another brick. But then in turn, he just goes to clock one of these guys over the head with it, right? One of these mutated forces. But then they start talking to him in the voice of Dormammu. "At night, did you hear us feast on your people as we laughed at you?" And Doctor Strange just says, "I did, Dormammu. It made me angry. Now, face me." And each of these guys goes to attack him, right? Each one of these mutilated animals in some capacity. And Doctor Strange just says, okay, right, I told you that I needed you to save yourself for the end, but this might be it. Can you hear me, right? Wake up, you filthy rag. Only for us to find out, he's actually talking to his cloak. And his cloak basically springs to life and then wraps around the necks of one of these critters and then basically kills it. And that's where Doctor Strange just says, thank you, right? I always wanted a magic scarf anyway. So he still has some small vestiges of magic available to him. But then he says, I summon the winds of Watum. And then he comments and says, my fingers do not move like they used to. That's where my orthopedic internship comes in handy. And so he continues trying to move and is able to do enough to push this thing off of him. But that's basically it. And that's where he just says, face me, Dormammu, or are you afraid of an old man? And the voice from the bag speaks to him again, right? They will wait for night to finish you off. That's what I would do. And Doctor Strange just says, I know. And this voice says again, sounds bad, Steve. You're dying, right? Because Steve just kind of starts to gurgle a little bit and then bend over. So clearly he's succumbing to his age. And he just says, yes. And that's where the voice says, I have done some bad things, but I never cannibalize myself. And that's where Doctor Strange just says, being the Sorcerer Supreme is the hardest job in the world. And that's where this voice just says, so there's still a world, huh? And of course, Doctor Strange just says, quiet, right? Or I will gag you with the crimson bands of Sidorak. So it's really more banter than anything else. And this voice just says, good luck, old man. And so at that point, Doctor Strange just says, show me the way home, and lights up the eye of Agamotto. And when that happens, he starts walking, and we get to this impact point, this massive crater, right, that's seemingly the source of everything being wiped out. And that's where he just kind of smiles, and that's where it lights the path, and he just says, by the Vishanti, I have found it. And he just says, this will do. And at that point, he casts the flames of the Faltine. Now, a quick explanation here, because I think this has kind of been lost over the years within the comic YouTube space. So when it comes to beings like Dormammu, and specifically Dormammu and his sister Umar, they are called Faltine. That's literally the race that they are. They are beings composed of pure magical energy. Contrary to what you might believe, Dormammu and his sister Umar did not always reside in the Dark Dimension. And even the Dark Dimension itself was not always the Dark Dimension. There was one point where it was just simply a cohesive realm. And then in the old Magic and Storm series from the 90s, we learned that there was some kind of an event that basically shattered that place. And it became what we now call the Archipelago of Anguish or the Splinter Realms. But that's where you start getting the landscapes of beings like Mephisto and Nightmare and so on and so forth. Dormammu just rules the biggest section of it all. Each one of these places kind of has its own dimensional barrier. It became its own individual dimension, which is why you don't see Mephisto sitting on his throne and like Dormammu's castle lingering in the background or something like that. It would be dope, but that's why you don't see it, because they're all just kind of their own little pocket dimensions, essentially. But what ended up happening is that somewhere along the line, Dormammu and his sister Umar entered into the Dark Dimension, and as beings of pure magical energy, basically ended up taking over that space, and have occupied it ever since. Now, there is certainly more to that tale than what I'm giving you here. This is just kind of the top-down overview, long and short explanation of it, but that's why whenever it is that Doctor Strange is in some capacity drawing on the powers of Dormammu or seeking an audience with Dormammu, he will summon the flames of the Faltine. Because as he starts to lay down, the voice from the bag tells him, now you're ringing the dinner bell. And Doctor Strange just says, indeed, I am. Just be ready to do your part when Dormammu arrives. And that's when he goes to sleep. And he wakes up in almost this kind of nightmare where you have Clea who's addressing him. And she says, you are not the man I thought you were. Is our marriage not worth fighting for? And Doctor Strange just says, Clea, right? I have fought monsters from beyond the veil that wanted to burn this world in hellfire. And I knew exactly what to say to them. But I do not have the words you need to hear now. And so at that point, Clea just says, then goodbye, Stephen, and leaves, right? Walks away. And so he effectively loses her forever. Now, again, that goes into the bigger storyline from The Best Defense. But the point is, that's where you switch over to what's happening here, which is that he's being chased by Nightmare. And Nightmare just tells him, this is how it ends. You were always so arrogant, Strange, as a physician and especially as a sorcerer. And he's effectively just fleeing from Nightmare. And Nightmare just says, you never stood a chance against your nightmare, and just kind of starts taunting Stephen Strange. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here is that there's two reasons why Stephen Strange is fleeing. The first ties into his own history, but the second ties into the power of Nightmare, because one of the things that people seem to really misunderstand is just how powerful Nightmare really is. In the Marvel Overture storyline, which we covered, there's a point where Nightmare, if I remember correctly, puts everybody in the world to sleep, and I think everyone across the universe to sleep, and then starts drawing on their power, and actually overpowers the living tribunal, right? It's crazy how powerful Nightmare can become. His powers mostly just draw from people who sleep normally, right? The way that human beings or sentient life sleeps. So you never really get to see him at the peak of his power, but that was a story where you did. And he took over and basically defeated every cosmic entity in existence, second to the one above all. It was nuts. It was a crazy story. It was phenomenal, but it was a crazy story. But that's where he's woken up, right? And that's where you find out Dormammu is here. He's literally arrived, and he just says, awake, Strange, and meet your doom. And that's where one of these critters just kind of looks and says, what is this thing, Master? And Dormammu just says, it is just a man. Never have you known his like. His people were consumed by my children before you. He's hidden away all these years. He was once a defender of this world. And again, the forces of Dormammu just kind of start laughing at Doctor Strange. And Dormammu says, I saved you for last. Now, at your end, tell me, Strange, what happened to your magic? You were not so diminished when we last fought years ago. And that's kind of the question that's been lingering, right? Because the reality here is that even though he's old, he should still be able to summon on the various magics that exist out there. But that's where he says, I spent my magic keeping a friend alive. And Dormammu torments him and says, it helped you not. But that's where Stephen Strange says, that remains to be seen, Dormammu. And so ultimately, Dormammu just tells him, after many years of hiding, it is time to finally end this war and disarm you. And he breaks the hands of Doctor Strange. And so now he cannot cast his most potent spells. And so when Dormammu says, now Strange, feel the full fury of my magical might, and goes to cast a spell, Doctor Strange just says, I knew I could count on you, Dormammu. He reaches into the bag and he pulls out the Hulk's head and he says, now the rest is up to you, Hulk. I hope you have the appetite for it. And Dormammu just fires off the shot, right? And just says, die. But in that moment, Doctor Strange is still alive. He's not dead. And the Hulk's head just says, now that was a meal. And in Dormammu seeing all of this, he just asks, what have you done, Stephen? And Doctor Strange says, only what I promised you long ago, that I would win. I magically altered the Hulk's diet. His strength is not fueled by gamma rays anymore. Now, he eats magic. After losing my battles, I did not have enough magic left for this end. That is why I needed you, Dormammu, and this is no ordinary bit of metal. This is what remains of the Silver Surfer's board. I knew I could ride a big enough wave if I had enough energy. And he says, now Hulk, go boom. And the Hulk just says, so long, Steve, and explodes in like this nuclear bomb of magical energy. And so Doctor Strange just says, right, it took decades to find the Hulk and the Silver Surfer's board, and a lifetime to find the courage to make this trip. Because when this bomb goes off, it kills Dormammu. He's destroyed by his own power. And at that point, Doctor Strange, in grabbing the board, is just hurtled out into space. And he says, I am all out of second chances. And he says, it all goes back to the train. I was arrogant to demand its destruction. That's where it all went wrong. The train must be preserved. My body was never going to survive. The final stage of this journey can only be accomplished by my astral form, and it can only live for a short time without my body. And he says, the Watchers are either a very good sign or a very bad one. I enter unknown space humbled by my failures, and ready to pay the price. If this is my final death, then it shall be a worthy one. Because when he enters into unknown space, he enters into the old space depicted in the early days of Doctor Strange's comics. Now understand, in this day and age, it just looks kind of cool, right? I mean, it looks pretty cool. Back then, this was huge. This was landmark in the comic book industry, right? People had never seen anything like this before. And that's one of the reasons why this kind of art style, this depiction, remains iconic to this day, to the point that if you were to find at some comic auction an untouched or an original version of this, right, that maybe it's just black and white, there are no colors or anything like that, it would probably sell for millions of dollars to the right collector. That's what we're talking about when it comes to this kind of depiction. And so it's so cool to see Marvel bring it back in the way that it's done here. But Doctor Strange says, if I can succeed in warning the Defenders to change course, then Dormammu's reign on Earth will never happen. As space and time bend and blur past me, I recall the wisdom of one of my teachers. Life is movement, action, change, and never-ending opportunities. I am home now. My friends have one last chance to defend this world. Because he literally goes hurtling through space and time with his body in tow and crash lands in this house. And that's the crazy thing about it, is because him landing here, this is where he's originally found by Bruce Banner in the Immortal Hulk Best Defense one-shot. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know if you guys want me to cover that story. It's really, really cool. It's really fun in Marvel. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.